So this is the beginnings of Nack Solo. Nack Solo is a very it's a very eccentrically complicated picture because it represents the battle that's going on between the natural and the spiritual realm within the mental perspective of his imagination, which is very much substantial because it's faith-based, and since faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things unseen, if it's substantial, that makes it feasible, it makes it almost concrete. And his battle between good and evil is projected through a senior intellect agent, which is an unofficial agency that he works for called James Burton. So he's a spy living in that espionage world and battling and trying to maintain incorruption, because he's a very humble and very solid figure, and he wants to represent what's right, and he does not want to be corrupted because he has a belief that's biblically inclined, and his representation of that truth causes a force of opposition that is projected through Burton, and Burton is extremely deceptive to a point where he has manipulated the truth and made it seem like it's in fact authentic, but that's exactly what it's against, is the authenticity of what truth represents. So his deceptive nature has become so perfect that it's very difficult to discern whether or not he's good or bad, because he's that perfect at resembling corruption. And Nack Solo is extremely against that type of systematic deception that seems genuine. So this is the beginnings of Nack Solo, and obviously it's the making. The warfare that's going on doesn't necessarily begin as a war. It begins as something that Nack Solo is almost tied into. He almost gets caught up in Burton's deceptive ways because he's trying to serve the organized system that he thinks represents authentic truth and incorruption. But slowly he gradually starts to understand and get a revelation of what Burton is in fact trying to do. So it has become a very self-righteous motive that he's trying to attract and draw Nack Solo into, because that's how he began, and somewhere along the line he fell into that trap, and he willingly became a factor of that extreme organized system. But slowly Nack begins to discover that this is something that is in fact organized and systemic and extremely distorted. So he wants to stand up for what's right, and begins to substantially approach and dissect the situation, and that's basically what the core of the movie's about. And ultimately, you also have Burton as being this sort of projection of Nack Solo's warfare that's going on even within him. So Burton is the embodiment of deception, and also a representation for Nack Solo to use as that self battle that he's also going through. So and in in that complex structure is a very fundamental approach that basically constructs the structure of the battle of good and evil that's going on within oneself, and how you can actually defeat the evil part of the innate nature of existence itself that is represented and reflected through the human spirit, and that the essence of the human spirit is innately good. So Nack taps into that original self and defeats the opposing forces that are coming against that innate essence. And that's in fact the core and the soul of the movie, is the battle that's going on within himself, represented and projected through Burton, and how he ultimately defeats and remains incorruptible. And it's also a very solid projection of the fact that righteousness, or being right, is always incorruptible, that the truth can never be void.
This is part of the pre-production. Location scouting.
So he remains connected to his source, and that's also projected within the film. And you have to understand, the movie's shot in a very perfectly perpetual design, meaning every day there's already a written and a laid out foundation for each of us to walk into. And even though I wrote the script and the screenplay in its entirety, I had to sort of extend from that blueprint and discover each moment as I was walking into it, because every day is a perpetual it's a perfectly perpetual design that we discover. And in that discovery, I was literally being spirit led, so I had to listen to my instincts and follow my instincts to discover those designated moments, which are perfectly designed for an appointed moment that you literally walk into every day. So it was based off of my screenplay, but each scene and each moment that I shot the film, there's an exposition process that I've basically walked into, and knowing what to shoot next. And the movie's also another way to explain that, because the movie, when you watch it, you'll see that each scene was a discovery. It was a moment that was designated for the film and for me to walk into. And within that exposition, the movie there's a very apparent extension of what it looks like on film. So the picture is a combination of both the blueprint from the script and the screenplay that I wrote, and also discovered the day of filming. So the combination of the construct of the entire film, which is based in the theme of the movie, the message of the movie, the story of the movie, the eccentric patterns by which I chose to shoot the movie, is very much irrationally sequential. So you can't necessarily watch this movie from a finite perspective. You have to be very, very much open-minded and infinitely aware of the perpetual design by which I shot the movie.
Location scouting.
There's also a very physical perspective of the warfare that's going on between Nack Solo and James Burton, or I simply like to call him Jay Burton or James Burton, because he represents both genders, and he's reinterpreted in many different versions. But the physical aspect of the warfare that's going on is a battle that's that's physically expressed through the art of combative formations, and even the physical conditions of how he extends that warfare that's going on in the spirit world and in his mind. There's a very perpetual sense of expression that Nack Solo has when he's in the midst of the warfare. So the combative form of his physical expression is also a very eccentrically perpetual expression, because that structure has a very fundamental and deeply grounded essential perspective, because that perception of him expressing what he feels and the anger in the middle of the battle, and how even though he knows it's a fixed fight because of the nature of incorruption, still the process of conception, of giving birth to that strength and walking into that realization of the fact that he's undefeated when he bases and grounds himself in that incorruptible perspective and foundation. So the martial arts aspect of it is very peculiar in how he expresses the frustration, and ultimately discovers the power behind the mental, the spiritual, the physical combination of what generates him as a whole being, and his connection to the source, which is biblically inclined, and obviously God himself personified through us. He understands that this is ultimately the process of conception that reaches a level of evolution where he grows into God and understands his godhood within that battle and that spiritual warfare, and discovers that not only was Burden an opposition, but also a trial, and has a higher cause, a higher purpose, which is for Nack Solo to discover and reach an extensive level of the perfect version of himself. So Burden's deceptive ways are a design, a formulated design that allows Nack Solo to discover the innate essence of who he is. So the equation is in fact perfectly balanced, because it creates an equilibrium within that warfare, because he understands the further he goes, now it's not a warfare anymore, it's a design that is laid out for him, and that he's being programmed and downloading these seeds and these softwares that construct the perfect version of himself and molds him into this completely incorruptible figure. And that's the essence of the foundation of the movie. It's going through the trials, going through the warfare, and then discovering that the trial and the warfare are connected, and that it has an ultimate and a higher perspective, a higher meaning as to why it happens, and that it's not always against, and it's not always war, that it's in fact a very much mathematical and scientific design of self-discovery and ultimately walking into his godhood.
so now I'm gonna go home and try to put these things together and just experiment with these shots. Do some fast forward, slow motion, crossfades, and blackouts, whiteouts. Man, I love this, man. And just simply trying to see what kind of shots that I can use or what kind of angles I can use for the intro shots. And I'm going to be working on the rest too. This is just the beginning of it. So we're going to go home now and try to put these things together and see what it looks like. Alright, I'm Nahor Solomon from Solo Man Films.